各位观众，大家好，欢迎收看华尔街电视，我是节目主持人孙昌国。今天特别为各位观众邀请到了以色列特拉维夫大学荣誉教授 Aron Shai， 为我们讨论以色列在中美角力下会做出什么抉择，决策形成背后考量的重点是什么。Aron 教授在以色列是非常有名的中国专家，著作等身，今天非常荣幸能邀请他来上华尔街的节目。Professor Aron, it's an honor to have you here. How will you describe the current relationship between China and Israel? What are the factors influencing the relationship and why?
Okay, thank you very much for interviewing me. Yes, I think the relations between China and Israel are very good, and they go quite smoothly. However, I think that due to the COVID-19 and the difficulties we had in the past 2 years, moving and communicating between the two countries, the relations were not as intensive as they used to be 2 years ago. So we have had some problems with the ambassadors moving from one country to the other. And I hope, and I think that at the moment, the Chinese ambassador to Israel is located in Beijing for a while for a certain course or, I don't know, consultations. But on the whole, I think relations are very good when we talk about trade, cultural relations, and so on and so forth, not to mention, of course, Chinese investments in Israel, which are going quite smoothly and nice. But again, I would say that I hope that in the next year, things will go back to normal.
All right. Nice to hear from you. Professor, China's relation with Israel, as far as I know, has to be based on pragmatic and non-political stance. As both countries had other countries' factors to consider. China had to manage and stay out of the Middle Eastern conflict. Israel has to consider United States' interest in the region. To you, how can you avoid choosing sides?
Yes, I'll tell you the truth. Frankly, I think it is very, very difficult to separate pragmatism from political issues, because very much, when you go ahead and you act and you practice, you have to bring into consideration, whether you want it or not, you have to bring political considerations as well, because China has its own political considerations and interests in the Middle East. And I will go deeper into that in a minute. And then, of course, Israel has its own, as you said yourself, political problems, not only inside, domestic problems, but it also has some political or diplomatic problems relating to the triangle between United States, Israel, and China. So in fact, it's very, very difficult to separate, because we are not talking about two companies or two individuals conducting commercial relations. When you deal with countries, you have to bring into the picture the political consideration as well. Now, if you want, I can expand and elaborate more, but depends on
Yes, please, Professor, elaborate it more.
Yes, I think, for example, that you see, China, as an academic, as a professor who has been dealing with China in the past 50 years or so, China has its own interests. And at the moment, it's very interesting because politically speaking, diplomatically speaking, China goes along with the Arab world and with the Palestinians, and you can check it and examine this thing when you consider China's behavior, so to speak, in the United Nations. So whenever there is a problem,
it's okay.
a debate in the UN, so quite automatically, I would say, Beijing actually conducts a policy which is very, very pro-Arab, shall we say, or pro-Palestinian. So in fact, if you check for the very long stretch of time, you will see that consistently China goes with the Arab capitals and the Arab governments. There is no question about it, no question. Now, on the other hand, and it is much more important as far as I'm concerned, when you talk about trade, when you talk about technology, when you talk about academic and scientific relations, when you talk about inventions, innovations, and all these things, certainly we do not see Chinese delegations go to Amman or to Damascus or to Beirut. I mean, if they want really to deal with the front and the frontier of medicine, for example, they don't go to Beirut, that's quite clear. They don't go to Damascus. So you have hundreds and hundreds of delegations, Chinese delegations, come to Israel, to the universities, to cyber centers, to nanotechnology, to medical, to hospitals and everything in Israel. They do not go to Arab countries. I mean, the Arab countries around us. But as I said, when there are discussions in the UN or various international organizations, the Chinese representatives automatically, it doesn't matter what the issue is, automatically, they never consider the Israeli position. So it's a two-pronged, so to speak, attitude, and this is very interesting. So what actually happened a few weeks ago is that for the first time, and Israel always goes along with China. I mean, I can mention, of course, the fact that Israel was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the PRC, the People's Republic of China, after 100 days that the PRC was proclaimed in January 1950. So you cannot find many countries who recognize Beijing and the new government in January of 1950. And even when, in the long run, there were no diplomatic relations between China and Israel, Israel consistently voted for China to be a member, a full member in the UN and of course, the Security Council. So this is a paradox, and there is a certain tension here, if you see what I mean. And a few weeks ago, for the first time ever, Israel joined a group of 40 countries who voted in the Human Rights Committee of the UN against China for the first time. But China, as I said, voted against Israel hundreds of times. So this is a paradox. And it's, I mean, if I were Chinese, I would be very proud of this policy because it's very clever. 很聪明, 很聪明, you say in Chinese. In other words, you get the best out of two worlds. You get the best out of the diplomatic and political world, and you get the best out of the scientific, academic, and etc. I mean, and trade from Israel. So this
Professor,
is very, very interesting.
Yes. Please continue.
Now, the decision by Israel to vote against China, or let's say for the resolutions that United States and Canada actually brought about in the UN, this was in fact due to two factors. One is pressure by Canada and the United States on Israel to change the current situation and join them when it deals with, problematic questions concerning Xinjiang and other problems that we know. So the Chinese government, I think, was a little bit disappointed. And I understand Beijing, because I understand the Chinese quite well, I think. Dealing with China, as I said, for over 50 years. I'm not Chinese, but I've written 8 books about China, and I've visited China many, many times and lectured there. So I understand the attitude of both countries. Now, another thing I think has to do with something which is not necessarily only Israeli. As you know, there are some doubts and there are some anxieties concerning the Belt and Road, and also Chinese investments and involvement in various economies. And again, as a professor and as an academic, I see both sides of the coin. In other words, I see that on the one hand, and certainly Israel, they want really, they want investments, they want foreign investments, and they want foreign investments, and China is doing quite well in this respect. However, at the same time, there are some anxieties as to whether we do not actually volunteer to give some scientific and knowledgeable information to the Chinese, who get it either by paying or by buying or purchasing Israeli companies, which are very advanced technologically speaking, you see. And also, there is a problem, and again, it's not only in Israel, it can be in Italy and Portugal and Germany and so on, even in Eastern Europe. So in other words, what I think we see here is, on the one hand, interest in Chinese investments. On the other hand, a certain anxiety to do with how much China would be involved in domestic or internal politics and economies. So when you talk about national infrastructure, for example, and the latest one had to do with the Haifa port.
Yes, Professor, you are correct to point out Haifa port.
Yes.
Because as far as I know, that the U.S. was very concerned about it, and even intervened, negotiate with the Israeli government. Can you talk more about it?
Yes. I think that, you see, we are doing very well economically and financially. Israel is not a backward country. It's very advanced. It doesn't belong to the third world. And therefore, it can pay for some projects. But there are some projects which we need Chinese expertise. Let's say when we talk about tunnels, when we talk about the light trains in Tel Aviv area. We don't know how to do it. The Chinese know how to do it. And also when we talk about the Haifa port, you see, the Chinese have done fantastic job there when you talk about technology, engineering, and so on. However, and you see, every problem that I raise here, or you raise, has two sides, sort of Janus face, as they say in the mythology, because you have the upside and you have the downside. Now, as far as Haifa port is concerned, they've done fantastic job, and they can bring, the most advanced ships and containers, that we never dreamt of. However, there is the following problem. Let's say if the Chinese are entrenched in the Haifa area or region, and in the port, of course, the question is, if there is an emergency or a state of war in the area, and diplomatic tensions or what have you between Israel and Iran, let's take this as an example. The question is, how would the Chinese actually, and I'm talking about the PRC, of course, how would the Chinese tackle this problem? Let's say I give you something imaginary, totally imaginary, but it can happen. Let's say they have a concession, the Chinese, in the Haifa area, an airport, and they've got it until, if I'm not mistaken, 2046, because they got it in just a month ago. They got it for 25 years. Now, let's say that in 10 years, in 15 years, whenever you want, there is a tension and there is a very, very disquieting tension between Israel and Iran, as everybody knows. Let's say the Iranians press the Chinese government not to go along with Israel, let's say imports to Israel, exports, but let's say even imports when we need various material, in other words, whether these are military or civil. The question is, and this is something that worries the people here in Israel, because on the whole, the control over the port is Israeli control. The Chinese have a certain section there which operates the port. But then again, there is a fear. And let's take another project which we talk about very theoretically, but it is possible in a few years' time. Let's say the railway from Eilat, the southern port of Israel, to the center of Israel, let's say Ashdod port, which lies on the Mediterranean Sea. So in fact, if you have a good railway from the south to the center, or in other words, from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, it's a sort of a continental bridge, which the Chinese are very interested in. Now, we cannot, by no means can we actually construct and go ahead with such a project. We don't have the expertise, we don't have the finances, and if the Chinese get the concession and get the permission to go ahead with that, then there are various problems. One problem that we can face is problem with the Egyptians, because they might see this continental bridge as a sort of competition with the Suez Canal. And secondly, again, there is a problem that if they get it, let's say it takes them about 10 years or 7 years to construct, and then about 30 years as sort of concession for this operating this railway. So we are talking about around 35 or 40 years, and the Chinese will be entrenched in the very middle of Israel. Now, again, if there is tension or war, we have had quite a few wars in the area between Israel and the Arab world, or even worse, between Iran and Israel, again, the same dilemma will arise. How would we tackle this problem? And this is a very, very serious problem because the Chinese will face a dilemma. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm glad you brought up the Iran issue. I think it is very important because as far as I know that China has signed a deal with Iran for at least 30 years. It's very comprehensive cooperation accord. So what's the general opinion in Israel about this?
Israel, official Israel, is very, very worried about Iran. No matter what government we have here, they all think that Iran is strategic threat, strategic danger to the very existence of Israel. Because in the case of Iran, we are not talking about border disputes or any other disputes that any other country may have. We are talking about the only country in the world which says, there are many organizations, extreme organizations, but as far as countries are concerned, this is the only country which says that Israel should not exist at all. So in fact, you cannot compromise. You see, there are no issues which should be dealt with or that we can accommodate or compromise with or whatever. We are talking about the very existence of Israel. Now, Israel is very worried, as you know, about the nuclear capability of Iran and to what extent it can develop this capability and bring about and actually practice in a situation that may arise. To what extent can it actually send missiles or even nuclear missiles into Israel? So there is a certain trauma here which one has to tackle. Of course, there are those who say that perhaps the Iranians exaggerate and they don't have this capability, because we have seen in the past few years that some strategists were saying, that within half a year or within a year, Iran will have this capability. But at the moment, they do not. But they advance very nicely. And as you said, the relations between Iran and China are really almost perfect. I mean, there are common interests, and they have signed this treaty.
Mutually beneficial.
And it's very comprehensive. We don't know all the details, but sorry? Yes.
It's mutually beneficial. The relationship is quite mutually beneficial because China needs a lot of resources, needs the oil, natural gases, and Iran can provide it. And China has the ability to help Iran in infrastructure and also in commodity goods. So the relationship, to me, it seems quite natural. They are very mutually beneficial.
Exactly. And then again, China, look, Israel is hardly 9 million people. It's a very tiny country. It's a minute portion of a certain region here or there in China. But, and China has its own interests. I mean, and Iran is a very important country, both as exporter of oil, as you said, but also as importer of Chinese goods. So there is a problem here. It's very difficult to settle this. But if we come to the original point, the point is that the more the Chinese invest in Israel, but I'm talking about national infrastructural projects, then there are some anxieties here. Should China face a certain dilemma? This is really the point I would mark.
Yes, it's understandable. Yes, Professor, you are correct. But it's an open, you just mentioned the nuclear weapon. And it seems to me it's an open secret that Israel owns the nuclear weapon. It's an open secret. So why Israel are so worried about Iran having a nuclear weapon? And because the US definitely will protect Israel.
Yeah, I see. First of all, as far as the nuclear capability, I don't think we have atomic bombs, but we may, according to foreign sources, I don't know, because it's not something which is open to the public here. I mean, we know that we are very advanced, but we have no idea whatsoever. I mean, the regular citizen, the one who is not within the very limited circle of decision makers, we don't know anything. and we don't know what they know. But if we assume that, in fact, Israel has, in the future, God knows when, nuclear capability, it doesn't solve the problem. Because, you see, we are talking about the first strike and the second strike. Even if we don't talk about nuclear capability, Iran and also Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, which is a proxy of Iran, they have their proxies in Lebanon and in Syria. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah has got a capability of, according to what I heard, but again, I don't know the numbers, but we're talking about tens and tens of missiles, which can they send to Israel and try to destroy airports, ports, hospitals, and what have you. So it doesn't really matter whether it will be nuclear or conventional. Israel is very small. And also the Iranians apparently have a long-range missiles capability. And the fear here is that when we talk about the first strike, and again, whether it is conventional or nuclear, a lot of damage can be created because we are not China or the United States or Russia or Canada, where we have the space and the luxury, shall we say, to actually, try to hide ourselves or find alternative airports, alternative places of shelter, etc. It's a very tiny country. Then there are people who speculate that should Israel be attacked, then Israel has got the second strike capability. But I, for one, do not understand, because the second strike capability, even if it's very successful, we are talking about a very great, in space, big country as Iran. So let's say you can create a certain damage there. And I'm not talking about nuclear one, but even theoretically, even nuclear one. So what? Because if Israel is destroyed, if we take the worst scenario, what would it happen if, let's say, from somewhere in the globe, Israel would be able to attack Tehran or any other city in Iran? So this is why one of the major issues in Israel, is really Iran, much more so than the Arab world or even the Palestinian, which is a very serious problem as well.
Professor, is it possible that since China is very friendly towards Israel, and also China has a very good relationship with Iran, can Israel consider about that China intervene or meddle between Israel and Iran?
No, between Israel and Iran, it's impossible. I don't think it's possible. Because as I said earlier on, we are not talking about any possibility of compromise.
But because U.S. doesn't have that close relationship with Iran, and it seems to me that Iran also regard U.S. as the enemy number one. So there are no channels. But now you have China. You have diplomatic channels with China, and also China has diplomatic channels with Iran. So why you cannot consider to use China as a negotiator or to negotiate or to pass some words towards each other?
Yeah, I see your logic, but I'm not very optimistic this is possible. It's true what you said. Beijing has a certain leverage over Tehran, something that the US hasn't got. That's true. However, we have to consider some points here. One is that even if China has a certain leverage over Iran, whether it would be ready in a crucial moment to actually use it, and whether it is able to use it. Because if we take North Korea, for example, China also has a certain leverage over North Korea, but it doesn't really tame North Korea. It doesn't bring Korea into the community of nations, and we know the story very well. In the case of Iran, it can be very similar. The Chinese can exert a certain pressure on Iran. But when it comes to the very crux of the matter, in other words, let's say when Iran says to Beijing, it's all right, you can exert whatever pressure you want, but we do not want Israel to exist. So then what? You see, when you have, as I said earlier on, when you have a position or a situation where is there certain disagreement over territory, over a certain minority, over a question of your finances or trade or whatever, even if it seems unsolvable, it is possible to think or to at least fantasize that a certain solution can be created. But when you talk about the situation of the existence or not existence, and if one follows what Iran is saying, I don't think that Beijing has any leverage here. But you are right that theoretically speaking, but we don't see the Chinese, for example, getting involved even in the Palestinian-Israeli situation, and they keep aloof. They do not want to get involved. And on the other hand, they have this two-pronged situation, which I described earlier on, when in fact they go with the Arabs as far as the political and diplomatic and rhetorics is concerned, and everything. It doesn't matter what the Arab nations or Arab representatives at the UN would raise. China automatically votes for it. And you can simply follow the record. On the other hand, China wants Israel to exist. They appreciate the Jews very much. They appreciate what Israel has been doing. And they send numerous delegations here. As I said, now we have had the corona, but sometimes really the Chinese inundate Israel and they bring engineers and medical researchers, technology, nanotechnology, agriculture, what have you, everything that the world actually, and in the past, even military, not now, but in the past. They do not get from the Arab countries much, you see, even almost nothing. What they can get from the Arab or Muslim countries, they can get the support of various nations, because you have 22 Arab countries and you have 50 or whatever Muslim countries. So the Chinese are doing a very interesting and calculating account of this thing. And this is the best as far as China, Beijing is concerned. They are very clever and they use the situation. The status quo is the best. And I think that in the future, look what happened in Syria, for example. Assad destroyed his own country. It's really 2 million people were killed, millions escaped to Turkey or whatever. We have never heard of any leader who actually destroyed in his own hands his own country. However, the Chinese consistently supported Assad no matter, and he bombarded his own people, his own cities, you see. And you cannot find any situation where the Chinese say, stop it, or whatever. On the contrary.
I think it's related to a very dynamic very difficult situation because it involves at least three parties like U.S., Russia, and China. So sometimes in the geopolitical issue, China will definitely side with Russia.
Yes, you are right. But I want to direct my remarks here towards a possible reconstruction of Syria. Let's say in 5 years' time or whenever, I don't know. The only people, the only country in the world who can help there and who can actually benefit from that is China. So I see a situation where China actually helps reconstructing destroyed Syria. And so they have a certain stake there, even for the future.
Professor, let's back to the economic aspects. China signed a comprehensive innovation partnership treaty with Israel. Is there any significant progress under the treaty?
Yes, I think this is a very important treaty. And again, as I said, the Chinese were very much interested in that because they are doing very well as far as innovation in the past years. And we see it in the last experiments which they had with missiles and the space, etc. However, they know that here in Israel, it's a sort of a lab. They can get a lot from it. And this is why, and we think that we can get some advantages having this treaty with China. However, as I said, because of COVID-19 and because of a certain relaxation, I would not say crisis, there is no crisis, but a certain relaxation when we talk about Chinese-Israeli connection, I think that here we also advance a little bit slower than we look at the very simplest thing is that no one can enter China and very few, almost no one can leave China. And also we have had the same problem here. So this makes it very, very, very difficult to go, fully into this materialization of the treaty. But the treaty exists and it's a very good sign. And I hope that in the future, we shall see it advancing as well.
All right. Professor, the Trump administration pushed normalization and peace agreements between Arab states and Israel, known as the Abraham Accords, wishing to link Gulf capital, Israeli technology, global markets, and Arab labor together. The first three aspects were largely achieved by the Accords, while the fourth pillar remains unsolved. What's your opinion?
I'm not very clear. Yes, I understand your question, and you are right. I mean, the Arab Accords are really historic accords. They change the atmosphere in the Middle East, and we see more and more Muslim countries that are interested in creating a certain contact with Israel. And this is a breakthrough. This is a breakthrough. There is no question about it. A few years ago, one could not even dream of such a situation. We have Morocco, and we have, of course, the Gulf states, etc. And we hear here and there, we hear about rumors that more and more, North African and other Muslim countries are interested to have good relations with Israel. So you are right. As far as capital is concerned, no problem. As far as technology is a problem, issue, there is again no problem. And certainly when we talk about markets, because we can export there, we can get some assistance as far as capital, etc. I'm not so sure I understand what you meant by the fourth element, and this is Arab labor. Are you
Yes.
talking about Palestinian labor?
Yes,
Arab?
Palestinian labor.
Yes, the Palestinian labor issue is a very serious problem because we need, here in Israel, we need workers, we need laborers who can help, you know, the Israeli economy emerge and further develop. There is no question about it. Now, in Europe, let's say in Germany, they consistently bring, let's say, Turkish labor from Turkey or from wherever. Now, theoretically speaking, Israel is in an ideal position because it has about 2 million and over. I'm not talking about the Arab Israelis. I'm talking about the Palestinians in the territories, in Gaza, in the West Bank. So we can actually use and enjoy a lot of Arab labor from there. And we still bring Romanians, Chinese, Turks, etc., etc. Why? Because there is the...
What about Jordanians?
And some Jordanians, there is no problem. You find, because there is a peace existing between Israel and Jordan, and we see Jordanian men mainly working in the tourist industry in Eilat, in the southern port. I don't think there is a problem there. But what I want to emphasize is the security problem when we talk about laborers coming from Gaza or from the West Bank, you see. Because in such a case, what we see is that one promile, perhaps, or, you know, here and there, you have terrorists actually penetrating through these sort of borders or the walls which exist. And then in Israel, there is a certain anxiety. Can we or can't we actually allow, you know, streams of laborers coming in? Because we have to go through a certain security checks. And this limits this very possibility of Arab laborers.
It's a tragedy, Professor. I know that there are so much concern about security from the relationship with China, from your relationship with Iran, even the workers, the security issue unfortunately involved in this matter. Again, thank you so much, Professor, to have you here. It's an honor to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I hope to hear from you, and maybe I'll hear this interview somewhere, or maybe you will send it to me.
Definitely.
Okay.
谢谢各位观众的收看，我们下次再会。
Thank you.